recording this session, and here we go. We're live. Okay, welcome. My name is Mario Sanchez, and I run training here at Sumo Logic. And today I'm going to walk you through setting up Sumo. And so most of you registered through our website, and I think I recognize some of the names. This is one of 3 sessions. Today we're covering setting up Sumo. So hopefully most of you joined the Quick Start webinar as well as using Sumo. It talked more about how, as a user, I would go and search, how would I, as a user, go and create dashboards. What we're going to talk a little bit more about today is how do I set up Sumo to begin with. I'm brand spanking new, and I want to bring data into Sumo. How do I do that? So just keep in mind, we're going to dive a little bit more into the admin side of how do I collect that data, how do I optimize my instance, and less about how do I use Sumo. If you missed any of these 2, you could always either join a future session or watch the recording for any of those sessions later on for you. And the last thing I'll say is this session, setting up Sumo, also prepares you for certification. There is a certification called Level 3 certification, which is for the Sumo Power Admin. So this webinar that you're attending, plus a tutorial that I suggest you try will get you prepared for the exam for Level 3 certification. All right, and there is no cost for it. So it's pretty straightforward for you to try it out. Okay, I'll try as much as I can to jump over to the UI and show you things. But since we're talking about setting up Sumo, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today, it's a little more administrative and a little more talk and best practices rather than doing. But having said that, as much as I can, I'll try to jump to the UI and show you how to do stuff in Sumo. So the couple of things that we're going to try to cover today, when we finish this webinar, ideally, you're going to be able to deploy a data collection strategy that best fits your environment. So the key thing here is that best fits your environment because there's several different collection strategies. And the idea behind that is we try to come up with different strategies according to your landscape of data. So we'll talk about the different ones. We'll talk about the pros, the cons of each one of those. And what you'll see at the end is that you might come up with a mix of different strategies depending on your landscape. The second thing is we'll talk about best practices around data collection. So it's pretty easy and pretty straightforward to install a collector and start bringing in data. But let's talk a little bit about how do I best implement that collection. You've heard me talk in previous webinars about coming up with a good naming convention for your metadata. So today we're going to talk about you've probably seen examples of what are good metadata. We'll talk about how to come up with a good naming convention. And again, whatever naming convention you come up with is going to depend on your environment and the data that you're going to be bringing in. And then the last thing, actually, there's 2 more things. I forgot to put a bullet point here. The other thing is content sharing. So as an administrator, you're most likely going to become the power user of this tool. You're going to know how to create searches. You're going to know how to create dashboards. And in a way, you're somewhat of the first line of defense for your users, right? A lot of them are going to come to you to kind of understand how to create queries, how to create that kind of stuff. So one of the things I want to talk about is content sharing, the ability to share the content that you build, but even more interesting, how to recommend content to the different teams that you're going to have. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last one we're going to talk about is, great, you're up and running, your system's been running for a good 3 or 6 months, and you want to start optimizing some of the searches. Now that you have a good sense of how people search, what people do in your environment, how do you use some of these optimization tools to create a searching experience that is very that is good for your users? Okay, so with that in mind, let me walk you through this simple demo. Again, I'm not going to jump into the demo. We covered this in the first one, but the idea behind Sumo at the end of the day is to have a scenario where you have alerts, where you have dashboards, where everything is in place so that you don't have to be there searching every time, but instead Sumo is working for you, and it's monitoring, it's troubleshooting a lot of this stuff for you. No, I should say it's monitoring and it's making the troubleshooting a lot easier for you. Okay, so at a high level, and you've seen slight variations of this slide before, but the data flow is broken into 3 areas. Data collection, which we use collectors and sources for that, and that's what we're going to be using or focusing on today. This number one area here. But then once you get your data into Sumo, you search and analyze it, and eventually you create dashboards, you create alerts to visualize and monitor your data. So we're not going to talk too much about number two, number three. We're going to focus on number one, how to get that data into Sumo, how to optimize those searches, how to make it easier for your end users. All right, so let's talk a little bit about data collection strategy. We can, or I should say Sumo can bring in data from just about anything, and that can be structured data or unstructured data. Here's some examples of sources that we can grab logs from. As a matter of fact, we actually have hired quite a few people from these different areas to improve our expertise in these areas. But you see on the left-hand side, you can have your stack, and it could go from network all the way through your databases, all the way up to your custom application code. We can grab data from any of those. On the right-hand side, you see infrastructure stuff like content delivery, your IaaS, your PaaS, or maybe security stuff that you want to be bringing in that data from. Again, that data can be structured or unstructured. You can send us a book if you want to. We'll grab that book and we'll index it. And then you will give us some rules. You will give us some sort of extraction rules or parsing rules so that we can identify what are the fields in that data that you're sending us that you care to be analyzing. And we'll go a little deeper into that. But the point is, you can send us just about any unstructured data. We'll grab that data and bring it into Sumo. All right, so let's talk a little bit about that deployment that you're trying to design as you're setting up Sumo and you're starting to think of the data that you want to bring into Sumo. A lot of you probably started with, well, let me just test this. Let me install collector here, and then bring in those log files. And then you realized, oh yeah, this is pretty good. Let me install another collector over here and try it out. And let me install a third collector over here and let me bring that stuff. And then some other teams started seeing that it was pretty useful, and they said, hey, can you install collector? Can I send you this data? And you're like, yeah, here's a collector. Let's get it, right? But take a step back and look at what you have in place now, because what I want to talk about is different strategies. Data collection is infinitely flexible when it comes to Sumo. We can grab data from just about anything, but coming up with a deployment that is right for you is going to be very, very key. Most of you as admins, you probably already came up, you already had to work with what we call an installed collector versus a hosted collector. If you haven't, here's the brief explanation for it. We call hosted collectors anything that is cloud-to-cloud integration. For example, if you're an AWS workshop and you're sending us AWS data, you can do this cloud-to-cloud collection. You can send us CloudFront data, CloudTrail, your CloudWatch data. All of your AWS data can be sent over to Sumo Logic without really having to install a collector. As a matter of fact, what happens is the collector lives on the Sumo Logic side, and then you just tell us how to send that data over to us. It's an HTTP post is what you're doing. Similarly, you can send Akamai data over to us, CDF and WAF services you can send over. We have APIs to things like Google Apps or Office 365. We even have some customers who, from clients, like in this case from mobile clients, they're doing HTTPS post and sending that data over to us. We'll talk later on about advantages and disadvantages of cloud-to-cloud integration. It's not always possible, obviously, right? Sometimes you don't have the ability to do a cloud-to-cloud integration. The other type of collector is what we call installed collector. And this is probably what most of you started playing with. You grabbed a collector, which is denoted here by a little blue square with a plus sign. You installed it in some machine, and then you grab the log files from that and you sent it on to Sumo Logic. You notice that we can grab from any operating system, so you could install a collector on each machine and send that over. Or what we see at other organizations is they might have what we call a centralized infrastructure, where they install a collector in one particular place and then send that data over to that collector and then onto Sumo Logic. And we'll talk about the properties of each one of those, the benefits and the pros and the cons for each one of those. All right. And similarly, if you have network devices, firewalls, If you have routers and you want to be sending that data over onto Sumo, you can use syslog to do that as well. Okay, so you kind of heard me talk about three main ones, and here's a graphic of what those three are. One is hosted collectors, and that's just cloud-to-cloud data collection. And we'll talk a little bit about those as well. And then if you're using installed collectors, you have two options. One is centralized data collection, meaning send all the data over to one or a few collectors and then onto Sumo Logic, or local data collection, in which case each data source or each host has a collector in it. And then that collector is grabbing data from those hosts and sending it on over to Sumo Logic. By the way, I will be sharing these slides, but just keep in mind that I put links to the appropriate place in documentation so you can get a lot more detail of the stuff that I'm covering here. I can't cover all the details, otherwise we'd be hours in here. So I'm going to covering the high level and then pointing you to the documentation for that kind of stuff. So a couple of things to keep in mind. If you are moving on to an installed collector, which is probably what most of you guys started with, right? There's a couple of things to keep in mind. So, oops, my mouse is acting up again. All right, so you might consider having a dedicated machine for your collector if any of the following happens. So if you're running a very high bandwidth network, and that is going to be producing a lot of logs, meaning high logging levels, then you might consider having a separate machine for that collector itself, because that collector is going to be chugging away. And if you don't have a dedicated machine, you're competing in resources. That collector is competing in resources with everything else that is there. And the second one is, obviously, if you want to have a central collection point for many, many sources, then you can have a dedicated machine for that. And we'll talk a little bit about pros and cons there. I'm not suggesting that you go off and create an infrastructure, a centralized infrastructure, but if you already have one, that's definitely something that we can take advantage of. All right. The other things to keep in mind is you might consider having more than one installed collector. So rather than just having one collector that takes everything, you might consider having more than one installed collector. If you expect a large number, if the combined number of files coming into one collector is going to be exceeding 500, if your hardware has memory or CPU limitations, if you expect combined logging traffic of one collector to be higher than 15,000 events per second, you might want to keep an eye on your network clusters. If they're geographically separated or region separated, you might consider having more than one installed collector on each one of those areas. And then if you prefer to install many collectors, to keep it local as well. Again, I can't go through all the details, but we have a documentation of exactly all the collector requirements for this kind of stuff. But I'm starting to give you a good sense of when you should have a dedicated machine, when you should be using multiple installed collectors. But let's talk about these three options that I was talking about: the centralized, the local data collection, the centralized data collection, and the cloud-to-cloud collection. So I'm going to break each one of those and talk about pros and cons. So let's say that you want to move forward with local data collection. That means that a Sumo Logic collector is installed on each of your target hosts, and then it's going to be sending the data that is produced on that target host directly to Sumo Logic's backend, right? And it's doing that through HTTPS connection. So here are the different source types of stuff that you can bring in, the usual stuff, right? If you have local files, you can send your operating system, your custom apps, any Windows events, you can send over Docker stuff, syslog things, so your network devices as well. You can even have scripts to be sending data. So you can have a database content that has a script, grabs that data and sends it over to Sumo, right? What I'm more interested is in reviewing these benefits and drawbacks. So the good thing about local data collection is that you don't need any additional hardware. Why? Because you're using the same exact machine that is producing those logs, right? So you have a collector on that same hardware and it's just grabbing data from there. If you want to use any sort of automation, so you want to use Chef, Puppet, or scripting, this is the easiest way to do it, right? You just have a local collector on any of those machines that get spun up. Now, some of the drawbacks are you obviously need outbound internet access to be able to send those logs onto Sumo. Excuse me. If this is not something that you can do, then you might have to consider one of the other strategies. So just keep that in mind. Outbound internet access is required for you to be able to have this scenario. So sorry, let me just take a sip of water. Okay, I'm back. The other drawback is that obviously there is usage of resources on that target host. So that target host is going to, that collector is going to be competing for resource usage with anything else that exists on that target host. So some of the typical scenarios is of customers that we see using local data collection is any customer that has a large amount of very similar servers, mainly because they're using some sort of automation, right? They're using Chef or Puppet and they're spinning up servers. So they would use a local data collection. Anybody who's using orchestration automation, as I said, would be using that. And anybody who's collecting OS and app logs, application logs, is probably going to be using some local data collection strategy. We see this a lot for anybody who has some sort of on-premise data center, right? With also some cloud instances as well. All right. The other strategy, let's see. Oh, there we go, is centralized data collection. So in this case, one or few Sumo Logic collectors are installed on a set of dedicated machines. Now, the keyword is dedicated machines, and these collect logs from all these various target hosts that are within your environment. And it could use a variety of mechanisms. It could use syslog, it could use WMI, it could use whatever makes sense for you. But essentially, grabbing this data and then forwarding it on to Sumo Logic, right? So some of the stuff that we see is syslog stuff, Windows events, and of course, any scripting. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Again, I want to focus on the benefits and the drawbacks. The benefits is your actual target host do not need outbound access, internet access, and that's key. I mean, for some of you, that's just a requirement that your security team has implemented or some sort of compliance, and therefore you cannot have a local collector on those machines because you will not be able to send that data out. So in this case, you would require to have some centralized data collection strategy so that your data can be sent onto that central collector and then onto Sumo. Here's what I was talking about before. You can leverage existing login infrastructure. What I mean with this is we at Sumo do not recommend that you go and set up a login infrastructure. And the reason for that is because there is a high cost to it. There's people that need to maintain it. There's rules that you have to set up. There's complexity. You have to have failover. You have to have, there's a lot that goes with it. However, what we do recommend is that if you have an existing login infrastructure, by all means, let's leverage that to use a centralized data collection situation. The downside of us having a centralized data collection is, my mouse is acting up again. The downside is that it's a little harder to scale because that means you have to set up more and more and more dedicated machines with more collectors as you grow. You have dedicated hardware, so that means there is a cost to it. And of course, there's some complexity to it. I was mentioning before, you need to account for failover. You have to set up your syslog rules or any other rules that you're going to put in place to get that data over to that centralized data collection and onto Sumo. Typical scenarios that we see this with is a lot of customers that are mostly Windows environments that have an existing login infrastructure. So something like a log stash of sorts. And again, this is for most customers that have on-premise data center. And then the last one that I want to talk about, which is kind of the simpler one for those of you who are already cloud-centric or cloud-savvy users, is cloud data collection. So most data is generated in the cloud and by some sort of cloud services, and then it's just collected by Sumo Logic Cloud through simple integration. So some of the source type examples would be your S3 buckets from AWS. We can do HTTPS posts, so any Lambda script, Akamai, one login, essentially just doing HTTPS post over onto Sumo, and also any APIs that we might have that you can send data over to us. The benefits, obviously, no software installation, so this is just cloud-to-cloud integration. There are some drawbacks. On the AWS side, there is some latency issues. They've gotten better over the last few months, but there's still some S3 latency issues getting data from AWS from the S3 buckets over to Sumo. But probably the biggest drawback is this one here, the HTTPS post. You would have to implement some sort of caching on your side before you're sending that data over to Sumo. So for the other two that I've talked about, for local data collection and for centralized data collection, they both use an installed collector. The Sumo Logic collector, before it sends the data over to Sumo, it does a few things. And within those few things that it does is it compresses your data, it secures your data, but the other thing that it does is it caches that data so that if it has some issues, if there are some issues going on, let's say the network dropped or whatever the case might be, it knows how to recover, right? That is not the case with cloud data collection. So pay attention with that. If you're doing cloud-to-cloud collection, you need to come up with some caching strategy on your end to be able to recover from any network failure as you're sending data over to Sumo Logic. All right. So typical scenarios are obviously customers using cloud infrastructure. And one thing that I really like to mention here is that although it is possible to rely on just cloud data collection, that's not typical. A lot of our customers have a mixture of these scenarios that I've talked about. So as you're thinking of your strategy, of your data collection strategy, just keep in mind it's most likely going to include one of these three strategies as you go through it. Let's see, I'm getting a question in the question tab. Okay, got it. Okay, sounds like someone on the call, Fred, has actually gotten certified in all three, which is good, and you just have some questions. So that's good. That's good, Fred. You can ask questions at the end, or you can always reach out to me later on if you want to as well. Okay, so a couple of things here. As you're bringing that data over to Sumo. So actually, let me stop for a second. Let me just go to the UI. Most of you probably already created a collector, but just in case, if you go to Manage Data, if you go to Collections, here is where all your collectors are. To add a new collector, you would go as simple as clicking Add a Collector, and from here, you start seeing the pattern, right, that I've been talking about. Are you installing a collector, or is it a hosted collector? If it were an installed collector, it would ask you, okay, you're installing on what? What's the operating system that you want to install this? So then it would send you to download the correct file, and then you would go through the process itself. Let me see if I have an installed collector somewhere here that I can walk you through. That I can show you some of the properties that I have. Here we go. All right, this one's not running. Here's one. By the way, this is a training instance. So there's a lot of noise in this, but let's just go grab this one. Here's a collector that's going against the training server. You would set up a name. You'd have a specific version which you can upgrade. In the advanced stuff, you would specify things like, do I want to manage my collector from a local configuration file? Do I want to manage my collector from cloud-based management, meaning from the UI itself as well? So setting up the collector, installing it is pretty easy. What becomes a little more interesting is after you've set up that collector, then you can start specifying the sources. What is the data that you're going to be bringing in? So here's a good one. Here's my training server. I've got that installed collector in place. And then I've added a couple of sources. Actually, I've added 3 different sources. The first one is my Apache file. And if I go in here and click on Edit, you would see that this source, let me make this just a little bit bigger for you guys. So in this case, I am bringing in a file, and I'm telling it that it's found in this particular directory. It's something, it's access.log. The collection should begin on this particular period. I could specify a source host. I can specify a source category. We're going to talk about source category in a little bit because this becomes pretty key as to how you're going to be searching that stuff. But what I wanted to talk about is a couple of these other advanced options in here. So you can specify files that you want to blacklist, stuff that you don't want to be bringing into Sumo. So, for example, if you don't want to bring in backups, then you can specify them here. The other thing is, do you want to allow Sumo to extract timestamp information from your log files? Most likely you will, right? Because you will want to have a good sense of when those log files came in. You can specify what time zones you're going to be using for that kind of stuff. We have a lot of our customers who just set everything to UTC to make it easier because they have servers that they're collecting from different regions. Or you can say, listen, I want you to ignore the time zone that is coming from the log file, and instead I want you to be using this other time zone as well. Not the likeliest of options in here. There's other things that come in here as well, like do you want Sumo to try to automatically detect the format? More often than not, Sumo can do it, but it depends on what your format looks like. If you have a format that we cannot identify, then you can obviously specify your own format here as well. Let me see. Let me go to the questions tab. There seems to be a question. So Rajesh says, we have configured installed collectors. So how log data stored? Is it stored in Sumo Logic somewhere? Because I see login just showing as some gigabytes every day. Okay. So Rajesh's question is, how do we store data in Sumo? So they've set up some installed collectors, and his question is, I can see that I can see my login just showing that I have gigabytes of data every day, but how is it stored? So Rajesh, just give me 1 second to wrap up this screen, and then I'll talk a little bit about how that data gets stored in Sumo. All right. So you notice that you can set up the timestamp format. You can specify it yourself. If it's something other than, you can even test that format as well. All right, more often than not, Sumo should be able to automatically detect it. You can also specify the encoding of that file. Here's another one that is pretty key. If your messages are just one single line, then it's pretty easy. Sumo easily recognizes that. If your messages are going to span multiple lines, then you can have Sumo try to detect the spanning of those multiple messages. So more often than not, you'll have messages that span. We can pinpoint where the end of that message is, and Sumo can do it. However, every so often, Sumo might just not know where your messages end. If it's your custom apps, then what you can do is you can specify using regex what's the boundary of your messages. So you could say all my messages end with the word error at the end, or all my messages end with the word done at the end. You can specify that here with regex boundary, and that's how Sumo is able to detect multi-line messages as well. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about here is processing rules for logs. So we have the ability to create, or I should say you have the ability to create processing rules that can do any of the following. So you can exclude certain messages. If you, for example, want to exclude a lot of the messages that are just noise, then you can say, I want to exclude any messages that have the following expressions in here. I can include only certain messages that have the following expression matched in here. So what this is going to do is it's going to eliminate the noise. It's only going to bring those messages that you want, that you care about. But the other two ones that I want to talk about is you can hash messages, and you can mask. You can hash data in those messages, and you can mask data in those messages as well. So, for example, if you find if you have social security numbers or medical records or phone numbers or any data that is personalized that you can identify a person with, you can hash or you can mask that message. And I'm assuming that both you guys understand the difference between hash and mask. But just in case, masking means, you know, remove it and change it with some other, with pound signs, for example. And hashing means, yes, hide it, obscure that number, but still create a unique identifier so that I can easily relate to it later on. right? So that's hash and mask. Again, all these things are documented, and you can find out a little bit more information. The last one in here is data forwarding. If you say a message matches this particular data, I want you to forward this message on to, and you can create a place where you would want to be forwarding that message to. All right. So again, creating or installing a collector is pretty straightforward. Creating the sources for that collector is pretty straightforward. Let me go to Rajesh's question, which is, listen, I've set up a few installed collectors. And I see that my data is going to different places. As a matter of fact, let me show them what you probably are talking about, Rajesh. If you go to account, my instance is a training instance, so I might not have all that interesting stuff. But you notice here that it's showing me my capacity is 36,000 GB, and I'm using about 4. So this is what Rajesh is talking about. Hey, I can tell that I'm using some, that I'm clearly loading some of this stuff. Where is that data stored? So the thing to know, Rajesh, is that Sumo Logic sits on top of AWS. We are an AWS customer, and Sumo Logic sits on top of AWS. So all the stuff that you're sending to us, we're storing in AWS as well, right? So that's how we're able to easily retrieve it, easily index it, and serve it on to you guys. When I talk a little bit about data indexing later on, I'll talk about strategies, how that data is stored, and strategies for getting that data. But at a high level, Rajesh, yes, Sumo Logic stores your data, and it stores it in AWS infrastructure. Okay, so let me just close this here. I want to show you another simple one. So do I have examples of it? Actually, I don't know if I do. I wanted to see if I had examples of hosted collectors, but since I have a training instance, I tweak stuff in the back end. But actually, let me show you this. Let me go back to that installed collector that I had, the training server. So the source that I just showed you was this Apache one. Let me show you this one called metrics. What I'm doing in this source is I'm essentially collecting metrics from Sumo Logic. This is a host metrics source, and I said I want to pull in CPU memory. This is pretty easy because we know what kind of CPU metrics are already in a host, so it makes it really easy to set up a collector for that, and I can just tick the boxes that I want and start bringing that data in. All right. The other type of collectors that I talked about were the hosted collectors, and those work fairly similar. I have a hosted collector, and that hosted collector can be bringing in this case, Akamai Cloud Monitor data over to me, right? Same thing, I can set up processing rules, I can detect multi-line, I can play with a timestamp. I guess the slight difference with hosted collectors is that I need a URL because I'm doing an HTTP post to that collector. So I can show the URL if you ever need it. You can go grab it here, or you can always regenerate that URL if you need to as well. All right. So pretty simple. That's how you get data into Sumo, either through a hosted collector or through an installed collector. Let's talk a little bit about this metadata design. And what do I mean with metadata? Every single message, every single log message that comes into Sumo gets stamped with the following 5 tags. The collector tag is the name of where it's coming from. The source, so where if it's Apache Access or Apache Error, for example, the host, the name of the host itself, the name of the path in the log file that it's coming from, and then the source category. And here is the key one that I want to focus on. Because source category can be freely configured, I want to talk a little bit about it. But before I do, just to show you where you set these things, it's on the collectors themselves. I'm going to go search again that one that I was looking at. Was it Apache training server? Training server. If you look at that, training. Did I get it wrong? Thought it was called training. Here, if you look at this one that we were looking at earlier, let me click on edit as well. Here is where it would get all that information from, right? The file path that I was talking about before, the name of the collector that I gave it, which is Apache. I'm sorry, the name of the source, which is Apache, the name of the host, which I would specify in here. And if you don't specify the host, it's just going to use the local machine name, right? The source category as well. If you specify source category, here's where it's going to get it from. The name of the collector, obviously, for this one, man, I lost it again. Where is it? Is the name of the collector is training server. All right, so that's where the data is coming from. So let's get back to source category. So what we recommend for source category is to use a naming convention that has component 1 / component 2 / component 3, where you're going from least descriptive to most descriptive. So you want to go from, oh man, this thing keeps changing on me. You want to go from general to more descriptive. In this case, I'm using prod my app1 Apache access, prod my app1 Apache error. You get the point. Prod my app1 CloudTrail. Parallel to that, I could have dev my app1 Apache access, dev my app1, and you get the point. And down here, I could have prod my app2 Nginx access. So you notice in this example, I've broken it by apps, and I've broken it by environment. My first two components are environment, and my second one is the app itself. Notice that you do not need to have the same amount of levels. CloudTrail has only 3 levels, and prod app1 Apache error has 4 up here. It doesn't have to be all the same. It could be anything. Again, I'm pointing to some examples here that I suggest you look at. The reason why we are suggesting some sort of scenario like that is because it's going to make your searching, the scoping of your search, a lot simpler. I could do a search where I can say where source category equals prod my app1 Apache star. And in that case, I'm getting all my Apache prod logs. I'm getting my Apache access and my Apache error. Or I could do something like star my app1 Apache star. And in that case, I'm getting Apache logs from all my environments, my production, my dev, my QA environments, right? The other reason why you want to come up with a good source data category is because down the road, I'm going to talk later today. I'm going to talk about partitions and indexing, which is a way of making your queries a lot faster. Essentially, partitions and indexes use your source categories for that, and you can make it pretty simple. You can say, I want to create a partition that where all my data that is prod my app1 gets stored. That way, whenever I search for prod my app1 data, I don't have to be searching through this partition that has my app2 data. So my searches are going to be much quicker to return. We'll talk a little more about partitions, but just keep in mind, partitions use source category for that. And then the third one to talk about is if you use role-based access control roles. So for example, if you want to have someone who only has access to my app1 data, you would specify that in their roles. And you can use source category for that kind of stuff as well. Again, source category is not only used for searching, you'll use it for partitions, you'll use it for role-based access control as well. So coming up with a good naming convention makes sense. So what are the common components that we see in customers? They'll use the environment, they'll use an application name, they might use some geographical information. For example, there are different data centers, maybe their AWS region if they're an AWS customer. It could even be a business unit. So anyway, what you can use here is anything that helps you separate your data, maybe even by different teams in your organization. And now the key thing is there is no right or wrong way of doing it. It really depends on your data. Look at these 2 different examples in here. On the top 4 lines and the top 4 descriptions I have here, I've broken it by environment. I have prod web access, web Apache access, and dev web Apache access. Oops, sorry, my mouse keeps acting up. I have prod DB MySQL error and dev DB MySQL error, right? So in this case, I've built it this way because more often than not, I'm only looking at prod data versus looking across. I look at specifically prod data versus dev data. Whereas in this case down here, look, I've done web Apache access prod and web Apache access dev. If I was concerned with my Apache access data regardless of the environment, then I might use this kind of strategy in here because I would do web Apache access star, and that would give me anything that has to do with web Apache access. So there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It just depends on how you will be searching your data. All right, so I've talked a little bit about metrics. About logs. When it comes to metrics itself, there's three ways that I can bring in metrics. One is ingesting your host metrics, which is what I just showed you in the UI. Remember, I was bringing in my host metrics from my training server. I can also bring AWS metrics. So AWS sends all its metrics CloudWatch, and we have a way to go into CloudWatch and grab that data from there. As a matter of fact, let me just show you if I were to go in here and say that I want to add a new collector. It's going to be a hosted. Actually, might be easiest to go. Yeah, that's fine. There are two ways to install collectors, which you guys probably already went through. One is the manual way, which gives you a lot more options. So you would go through here, you'd say, I want a hosted collector, and kind of go through the motions. Or you could also use the setup wizard. And the setup wizard just makes it a little bit easier for you. It kind of walks you through it. The drawback of the setup wizard is that it doesn't expose a lot of the more advanced features for you. It's just assuming that you're doing a straight up setup. But let me just walk you through one here. So let's say that in this case, I'm going to be sending CloudWatch metrics. You notice that it starts asking me, okay, what data type are you going to be sending? And one of them is the CloudWatch metrics as well. But look, there's host metrics, there's all this good stuff here. So if I was sending CloudWatch metrics, I would click on that and it would start asking me, okay, have you set up the access key and the secret access ID for that? And if you don't know how to get that from AWS, here is how you go about getting that kind of information, right? So it kind of walks you and it steps you through it rather than you having to go and figure it out on your own. Let me see, there's another question. Fred has a question here and it says, one of the questions seem to indicate you can collect a log and metrics at the same time in the same collector. Am I wrong? So Fred's question is, can you collect logs and metrics from the same collector? And the answer is yes, Fred, you are correct. The example that I was talking about before, as a matter of fact, let me just cancel out of this, go back, exit the setup wizard. If you look at this training server is a collector called training server, and it's pulling in log files, the access log files, and it's also pulling in the host metric logs from here. So you can, within the same collector, have a source for logs and have a source for metrics as well. So yeah, you are correct. The answer is yes. Okay, so yeah, I was just showing you examples of how to do it. The other data that we can pull in is maybe you have stats D metrics and we want to bring in stats D metrics. You can click on that and it says, do you have an existing collector on that box where you're going to be pulling in that data, or is it a new collector? And if it's a new collector, you'd set up your operating system. It would download the appropriate collector and all that good stuff. If it is an existing collector, let's say you already have a collector on that machine, you can specify which collector it is and you can start bringing in that data. So this should answer your question, Fred, again, that yes, you can have that stuff. And I see from your comment, I see that you were confused about a source versus a collector. So you're right. I've heard this before, that you will have. Let me just get to the UI to show everybody that you will have a collector, but that collector could have multiple sources as part of it, right? So a source could be Apache logs in this case, but another source could be host metrics. So all of them within one same collector. Okay, good stuff. Great to hear this is making sense for you guys. So again, we can bring data from all these different sources when it comes to metrics themselves. Kind of to answer your question again, yes, you could already have a collector bringing in logs from your custom code, for example. It's already getting logs. You could have that same collector grab metrics like graphite metrics from a library, or perhaps from collect-D. That collector can be grabbing that data, or perhaps your host metrics can go to that same collector and then on to Sumo logic. Stats-D works a little bit different. For those of you who are familiar with Stats-D, Stats-D requires a server itself. So Stats-D would send the logs over to Stats-D server, my mouse again, over to Stacy's server, and then we can send it over to a Sumo collector and onto Sumo Logic. And the third option that I talked about was those AWS CloudWatch metrics, right? Which AWS sends all its metrics to CloudWatch, and then we have a cloud-to-cloud integration to send those over to Sumo. All right, so I think what you've seen so far is fairly straightforward. Getting data into Sumo is the mechanics are not that difficult. Once you get that data into Sumo, you start searching that data. You start using Sumo to analyze your data. For example, let's say I had my I wanted to choose source category. Source category equals labs Apache access. Okay, and you start searching your data and it's all good. And let's say that you come up with some pretty good searches that you actually want to, you'd love for your team to be able to use. So actually, let me just go open one to make it a little more interesting. I'm just gonna go open a search that someone, let's say this one. Okay. So here is a search that you just built. It's a great search. You save it. You've got that search now in place, or let's say that you even put together a dashboard and you have a dashboard that is out there that you want to save. Well, what you might want to do is a couple of things. One is you want to start sharing this data with a lot of your users. And this is key because you don't want everybody in your organization recreating the wheel. So how do you share stuff? I'm going to show you a couple of things in here. One is you have your recent, you have anything that you starred, you have your personal folder, which is anything that you've built, but you also have this little folder here called the library, which is anything that someone has shared. And in the library, I can see things either by creator, so these are the different people in my organization that have shared stuff, or I can flatten out this if I don't want to see what Stacy specifically shared and what this Sumo Logic training users shared, but instead I just want to see it all. I can do this, and it's under content. I can see everything that has been shared with me, right? So that's good. But also check this out. There is this admin recommended, which all of you are. You're administrators, and you can recommend content to people. So let me walk first how to share stuff, and then the second one is how to recommend stuff. So let's say that I built a dashboard. Let's say I built this Apache Access dashboard, and I now want to share it, right? Here is, I'm going to go into my instance. Let's say Apache status codes, and I want to share this dashboard. I can go here and either click on this icon, or I can click on this little guy here that says share. And you notice that this dashboard is owned by the labs user training. There's a user called the labs user training. They're the owner and they manage it. But they've also granted edit access to just about anybody in the organization. And that's why I'm able to go in here. But I can also go in here and say, well, listen, I want to have my interview candidates have view access of this thing. But I also want to allow anybody who is an administrator to have, so you notice in here, I cannot grant anybody manage access. And the reason for that is because I am not a manager myself of this tool. This is something that was owned by someone else, and I don't have the ability to grant manage access. I can grant them edit access or view access. Let me cancel out of this, and let me show you something that I do own. So I'm going to go into my personal folder. I'm going to grab this one here called the Apache Access Dashboard. Now, this is one that I do own. To show you that, I'm going to click on Share, and you know that I'm the owner, right? I manage it. So I have given edit access to anybody who's a training analyst. I have given view access to anybody in my organization. And how did I do that? I just chose whomever I wanted here. I could have chosen specifically a person. Let's say that I wanted to share this with Stacy because I wanted to make her a manager as well. So I'm going to say, I'm going to allow Stacy to manage this dashboard in case I happen to be on vacation or because we both want to collaborate on the creation of these dashboards. But I also have a couple of other options as well. I can say, well, Stacy, in addition to managing this dashboard, she has the ability to grant, manage, edit, and view access to other people. She has the ability to only grant, edit, and view access to other people, or only grant, view access to other people, or I don't want to give her the ability to grant anything. She can only manage it, but that's about it, right? So I have a pretty granular way of defining who can manage it, who can edit it, who can view it, and also who can grant those same kind of access roles onto other access permissions onto other roles themselves. Right. So there you go. So now you know that sharing is caring. As you create content, you want to be sharing it with your users. Because remember, as an administrator, you guys are probably power users. You're going to be the ones who know a lot more of what's going on in here. It will take a little bit of your sharing and caring with other users before they actually get onto it. But the other option that I wanted to show you was this one here. How do I do some admin recommended stuff? To do that, what you want to do is, right now you're viewing this data as me. You have the ability to switch to content administrator. And it's just going to switch and close all tabs, right? Because now the content administrator. So now I'm viewing this data as a content administrator. What that means is I can view all content. Whether someone has decided to share it with me or not, I can view that content. There's a few reasons for this. Let's say that, here's a good one. Let's say that Stacy, I'm going to go to users here. And let's say that I'm picking on Stacy again, just because I remember her name. Let's say that Stacy had created some content in here. And one of the things that she had created was a, I'm not finding one, but let's say that one of the things that she had created was a scheduled search, a search that runs on an hourly basis. And if something's going on, it triggers an alert. Well, let's say that it's a false positive. That scheduled search is triggering, and we already know the reason for that, and we know it's a false positive. But Stacy's on vacation. She actually left last night, and there is just no way for us to turn off that scheduled search. Well, guess what? Now, as an administrator, I can go in and I can edit it, and I can tweak that scheduled search so that it stops firing every hour. Or probably more interesting, I can share that scheduled search so that more people can manage it, so that more people can edit it, so that you don't have that situation happening in the future. All right, so the first reason why you can view things as content administrator is to be able to look at all the content that is out there. But the second one is because you can actually recommend content. So let me go back to, you can create folders in here as well. Let's say that I wanted to create a folder called DevOps, or security. Let's say that I had a security team. So I can create a folder called security team, and then start putting stuff into that security team folder that is particular to that team itself. And then I can share that entire folder with the security team. So I'm going to show you. I'm going to go and look for something that is in here. Let's say I'm going to go into, I'm going to pick up Stacy one more time. Let's go see where she was. Again, this is a training instance, so there's a lot of nonsense in here, but disregard that. So I'm going to go in here, grab this one, and I'm just going to say this is something that I actually want to put in that training thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this thing, excuse me, and I'm going to move it, and I'm going to move it into admin recommended under security and say move, right? So now what I can do is I can go in here and I can say, you know what? I want to share this security team folder. I could share specific items in here. I could go and share just this thing, or I can share the whole security team folder, and I can say share, and I'm going to share it with, I don't have right now a role called security, but let's pretend that this trainee role was that. So I can go and say, share it with this trainee role. I want them to have just view access to that. Click on save, and there you go. I just shared that with any of my security teams, or in this case with the training team, so that then when they log on, let me just get back to my own instance in here. Excuse me. So that when they log on and they click on this library, for anybody who is a trainee, they will see here under admin recommended, they will see a folder called security team, and they can go and look at the content of that kind of stuff. So One of the biggest roles that you will play as an administrator is getting your users to adopt Sumo. This is one of the biggest components that you can use, starting to recommend content for those users so they can take advantage of that content, reuse it, and tweak it as their heart's content. Remember that once they have access to a dashboard, let's say that in this case, here's a dashboard that has been shared with me. There's nothing stopping me from making a copy of this dashboard and tweaking it to my needs, right? If this is something that I find that it's pretty interesting, I can always go to the search behind it and then save this search as my own search because it's something that helps. So sharing with your users is not only telling them what they should be looking at, but also giving them the tools to be able to start fishing for themselves and creating some of the stuff that they need. All right? Cool. If I see no questions, I'm going to switch over to the last thing that I want to talk about today. And that is not sharing recommending. I just talked about this, but optimization tools. So let's say that you're 3 months into this, 6 months into this, your users are starting to use some of this data in Sumo, and you start finding that, wow, their queries are taking a little longer than you thought, or someone's complaining that that they they'd rather that they want to search for 365 days worth of data, but it's taking a little longer. So how do you optimize some of this stuff? How do you start making your queries a lot quicker? So the stuff that I'm going to talk about is, let me close this, open in here, go to manage data, and click on settings. I want to talk about 3 things in particular. I want to talk about partitions, I want to talk about scheduled views, and I want to talk about field extraction rules. So this first 3 that are in here. And let me talk about field extraction rules first, because even though it's not the order of the slides, this is probably one that you've already heard me talk about. So what field extraction rules allow me to do is they allow me to parse the data before or as it's being ingested into Sumo. So let me show you this MongoDB one in here. What this one is doing is, let me edit it so you can see. What it's saying is that any data that comes into Sumo that matches source category equals labs MongoDB, I want you to parse all these fields out of it. Timestamp, severity, component, context, and message. Why? Because I know that everybody in my organization who is looking at MongoDB data is going to need these fields. And with those fields, they can go and analyze the MongoDB data. Similarly, everybody who's coming in and looking at Palo Alto networks will use this field extraction rule. So what that does is what that does is it extracts those fields ahead of time so that people don't have to be doing it during query time. And that just makes your queries a lot quicker. So let me go over to this field, to this slide in here and just talk about it. So field extraction rules, because they extract the data at the time of ingestion, my goodness, you're going to get better performance from your queries because now those fields are already indexed. You start standardizing the field names. So now, let's say that you, for your Apache, you're going to have the same name for everybody. Everybody's going to call them status codes. You're not going to have someone calling it status, another one codes, another one status codes, another one SC. But instead, everything's going to be called status codes. And your searches are going to be so much simpler because you don't have to be parsing anymore because parsing has been done at the field extraction rule level. Keep them simple. As much as you can make very simple specific rules, it's easier to debug a simple rule than it is a very complex rule. And then you obviously want to parse them, test them. I'm sorry. You want to test them thoroughly. I showed you yesterday how to use the no drop. I showed you how to use isEmpty. You want to be testing these rules before you actually implement them. There is a limitation, which is going to be removed soon. The limitation is that you can only have 50 rules or 200 fields. I wouldn't worry too much because that data, those fields are going to be going away. There's another question from Fred. He's asking, how often is data ingested? That depends on you, Fred. If you are sending us cloud-to-cloud integration, that data it's real time. You're sending us data all the time. If you have it scheduled so that we grab the data on a regular basis, then that's what's going to be happening. But basically, you control the time intervals. You probably saw as we were setting up some of the. Let me just show you and see if I can set it for you. When you're setting up your collectors, so I'm going to go to collections. I'm going to go to, oh, let's look for that same training one so I don't have to go and fish for another one. So if you go here and you look at this metrics one of the things that you have here is, what's the scan interval? Do you want me to scan every 10 seconds, every 15 seconds, every 5 minutes? For logs, it's just how often you want to get them. For metrics, there is an implication for it, right? Because if metrics are time intervals. So if you collect every 5 minutes, then that's drastically a lot less data that you're bringing into Sumo, where if you're bringing it every 10 seconds as well. So you control the scan interval. For metrics, for logs, you can set it up so that if it's cloud to cloud, it's going to be collecting them on a regular basis, or however often that log file is available for Sumo to collect. Okay. All right. So that's from a field extraction rule. As we're getting data, we can parse that data. The second one is partitions, and this one is one that I will highly recommend you consider, 3 or 6 or 9 months down the road. What partitions allow you to do is to create, let me call them buckets, or let me call them chunks of data. So when you're running a search, instead of running a search against all your data, what you do is you have partitions, and those partitions will it allows Sumo to be a lot more effective grabbing data from those. So let me show you an example. Let me go here to settings. Let me go to partitions. And I have some that I've deleted because I've been playing with this. But let's say that you had my app 1 and my app 2 data, right? If you create a partition called my app 1, what that means is that when you run a query, if you create 2 partitions, my app 1 and my app 2, that already is limiting by 50% for you to just search 50% of your data, because there is absolutely no need for me to go search my app 2. So if your search query says, oops, let me see if I can edit this thing. View details. All right. No, I can't edit it here, but that's okay. If you have, oops, I clicked on the wrong one. Here we go. So this says source category equals prod / my app 1. What that does is, when you create a query, when you create a search that is looking for source category map my app 1, Sumo Logic in the backend does query rewriting, and it says, okay, I really only need to go to this partition and look for data in this partition. I no longer need to go to all these other partitions that are in here. I don't need to go to config logs. I don't need to go to prod, test partition, and so on and so forth, because I know that data is going to be in that particular partition. So what you're doing is you're breaking your data into smaller chunks, and that allows you to make your queries a lot faster and perform a lot better. Couple of best practices around that is, try to not have overlaps. If you have overlaps in your partitions, in the definition of your partitions, for example, if you had prod my app 1 access, and then you had another partition that says prod my app 1 star, then you're going to have overlaps. That access data is going to go in the first partition, and it's also going to go into the second partition, because it goes into both. That's definitely not what you want to do. Sumo Logic will take care of deduping the messages for you. So when you run a query, Sumo will be smart enough and say these 2 messages are identical, same timestamp and everything. So from a results perspective, you are getting the results you want, but keep in mind that from a storage perspective, you're storing that message twice. So you're going to be charged for that message twice. So the good thing is, do not overlap. The other thing is, you don't want to have too many partitions. Too many partitions, and you're just going to start having too many small chunks, and it's going to just make it hard for Sumo to know which partitions to go to. You don't want to make your partitions too small, because then they're holding very little data and not all that interesting. You don't want to make them too big, because they hold a lot of data or more data, and therefore you're not taking advantage of the purpose of partitions. The question from Rajesh is, are partitions charged separately? And the answer is no, we don't charge for partitions, because if you think of it, if you don't have partitions, Rajesh, that means that all your data is going into, let me just show you here. If you don't have partitions, all your data is just going into the general index, as shown in here. So in reality, you're still bringing in the data, right? I'm still bringing in my 4 gigs of data. What you're really doing is you're creating partitions so that the data goes into different buckets, so that it's easier for you to go and search that data. When you put in different buckets, you can say source category equals artifact and artifactory, and it will know to only search data in here. So it's not that you're getting charged separately. That's not the case. What I meant to say with the overlap is, if you have definitions of partitions where a message gets routed into 2 different areas, then that message is going to be charged twice versus just once. So that was the charge that I meant about that. All right. And so the last thing I'm going to say is, the key to partitions, oh, my mouse again, the key to partitions is that you want to group data that is searched together most often. So if you have team A and team B and team C who are using your environment, and those teams very rarely search data across the other teams, then that's a great way to partition your data, right? If you search your data by prod and dev and you very rarely search across, then that's another great way to partition your data. So think of how do you search your data? And that's why I'm saying that this is not something you want to build right away, but you want to build down the road once you get a better sense of how your data is going to be searched. Okay, another question from Rajesh. What is the partition limitation, if there is any? So there are no limitations. You can create as many partitions as you want. However, like I was mentioning before, you probably don't want to create too many partitions, because then you are just making it harder for Sumo to be storing data into too many places and then going and trying to retrieve from the different places. And you're storing very little data in each one of the partitions, which is kind of almost the same as putting all the data into one same partition, right? So you want to find a good medium between keeping it under 20 and then to house between 1 and 30% of your volume of data. But there is no cost for creating partitions. You can create as many partitions as you need. Again, there's links here to a little more information in there. All right, the last one I want to talk about is scheduled views. To Rajesh's question, there is no charge here, again, for scheduled views, but think of scheduled views as a copy of your subset of, it's a subset of your data, and it's very similar to like your relation database view, materialized view in relational databases, right? It's like a materialized view. What you're doing is you just have a view of normally aggregated data. So 99% of the time, or the use case for scheduled views is you want to run a search for 365 days. Well, why don't you pre-aggregate a lot of the data that you want to run and then store it in a scheduled view, so that when you run that query, it's going to be a lot easier to get that data out of there, right? We recommend that you have a pretty decent selectivity in your scheduled views. And the reason for that is you don't want to create massive scheduled views that are going to hurt you and just not have, not be selective enough. So normally with your scheduled views, you're duplicating your data. There is no cost for using a scheduled view, but remember that it duplicates the data. Not duplicates the data, but there is a cost to storing the data of a scheduled view. There is no cost for using the scheduled view. So you want to make it selective. You want to pre-aggregate that data so that it's stored. And then once a minute, more or less, the service kicks off and it goes and runs your data and it sets that scheduled view again. The other cool thing about scheduled views is it allows backfilling. You're welcome, Rajesh. Rajesh is saying that I assume partitions is a pretty helpful feature for him. So that's good to hear. So the other thing with scheduled views is that it allows backfilling, meaning that you can go back to the beginning of time in terms of your data. So let me just show you what a scheduled view looks like. Let me go in here and let's pretend that I was going to go create one. Actually, here's some good ones. Let's take this Artifactory logins one. Can I view that one? No, actually, that's, oops, what did I do? All right, let me just go here and let's say that we wanted to create a new schedule view. So you would name the schedule view, you'd specify the query that you want to do. And again, remember, you want to aggregate the data, whether it's you counting it, you're summing it, some sort of aggregation, because that's going to allow you to then run against that aggregated data. In the start date itself, you can go back as far as whatever your retention period is, which is pretty cool because you can look at historical data as well, right? And then you can specify how much data do you want to keep in this scheduled view. Do you just want to keep 7 days worth of data or whatever the case might be, so that your scheduled view doesn't grow crazily out there. So scheduled views, just another great way to improve your performance because your queries can go against these pre-aggregated views and grab that data from Sumo again. Okay, cool. So those three that I just talked about are going to make your queries a lot easier to or a lot more performant, right? I created this chart kind of to walk through the different use cases, but oops, here my mouse keeps acting up. Sorry about that. But if you want to run queries, so here are the different use cases, right? If you need to extract fields from logs and make them available to all users, then you want to be using a field extraction rule. If you want to use data to identify all these long-term trends, then definitely help yourself with a schedule view. Create a schedule view that has pre-aggregated data, and that way your queries are going to be much faster. If you need to segregate your data so that your queries run faster, or so that certain people don't have access to certain data, then definitely segregate it with partitions. That's another great way of using partitions, right? If you have 3 different teams using Sumo logic, but their data needs to be exclusive, we'll put them in different partitions, and then in their roles specify that they can only have access to one partition itself. If you need pre-computed or aggregated data, of course, that's a scheduled view. And for role-based access control, what I was just talking about, the ability to deny or grant access to data, you can use partitions, and you can also use scheduled views. You can also give people access to only the scheduled view, so they only see the pre-aggregated data and not the log messages themselves. All right, I think we've covered quite a lot today. If I were to summarize, we talked about the ability to ingest logs, any type of structured or non-structured data. The key here is that you need to start selecting a deployment option that really best fits your sources. You have to look at what you have and what goes in it. And a lot of times you might have a mix of all 3 different options, the cloud-to-cloud integration versus central infrastructure and local messages. You want to come up with a robust naming convention. If you don't have a robust naming convention in your metadata, this is the time to change it. You don't want to wait until you have a lot more users with a lot more content. Change it now when less people are using your environment. The last one that I didn't add here is share your content as much as you can. Share, and recommend to your users, and then take advantage of these optimization tools that I just talked about. Maybe it's nothing to do right away. Actually, I take it back. What you definitely want to do right away is your field extraction rules. As much as you can, create those rules because your users are going to take full advantage of it. So my call to action here down at the bottom, set up your deployment option or hybrid option, as I was talking about, that best fits your environment. But the true call to actions is, 1, look at your source category. Make sure that it's robust. Make sure that it's something that's going to work for you guys, for your partitions, for how your people are searching. And the other one is set up your field extraction rules for your popular data sources, because that's going to make the life of your users a lot easier out there. All right, so with that, let me pause here for a second and let me open it up to questions. I'm going to stop the recording as well, but please send me your questions.